You're listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and it is a joy to welcome KJ Ramsey back to the podcast. KJ, it's good to see you.
It is so good to see you.
You have recently, a couple months ago, wrote a vulnerable and candid book, your second book, which is called The Lord is My Courage. And in part, this book is about your experience of being harmed in the church. And anytime we write something autobiographical and put it out in the world, we're taking a risk. But in writing this book, I think you took an even greater risk than that, because it is the height of risky writing to share how you have been wounded by others. So can you tell us a little bit about why did you write this book, The Lord is My Courage?
It was worth the risk to write The Lord is My Courage because the goodness of God to seek us in our pain, in the places where we have been harmed, is too good to not share. And I don't see it being shared enough. So the goodness that I experienced of God seeking me and my spouse in the wilderness of feeling exiled from the institutional church, I could not keep that goodness to myself. And on the other side of that, the anger is too true to not articulate in a way that allows others to have permission to move into wholeness themselves. I believe that anger over injustice and wrong is the mobilizing energy that takes us into attachment and authenticity that allows us to be fully alive. And I do not see an adequate modeling of room and permission to be angry, especially among Christians. So it was worth the risk because I want others to have permission to express the truth about what they've experienced in the manner that will move them into aliveness. And I'm more alive today because of this process, including the writing of the book, than before having to face the truth about the system that we were in. So that's why it was worth the risk. And the risk was definitely real, and it remains real.
The book is structured around Psalm 23. The way you organize the book is you break down each verse of Psalm 23 into phrases, and you write a chapter about each phrase. And as you're commenting on each phrase of Psalm 23, you also share parts of your story of spiritual trauma, of church wounding. And here's what you say to the reader at the very beginning. You say, "While your story might not mirror mine, I am praying that these words will help you acknowledge your own places of pain. I pray that my honesty about what happened to me and my husband in a faith community can give you courage to be honest about the harm in your life." Why is it so important to be honest and clear about the ways that we have been harmed? I mean, why is it important to write down our stories of harm and even to speak them out loud? Because that's what you're inviting the reader to do right from the beginning.
Right. Yeah, I think before I answer that, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge for those who are listening that talking about this, even hearing us talk about this, is probably, there's a good chance it feels really activating. I think it's an inherently extra activating and risky for a lot of us who have grown up in the church, or the church has been a large part of our identity, to hear people talk about harm that happens in the church. And so those who are listening, if you feel your heart racing right now, if your hands are clammy and you're starting to kind of wiggle around in your seat, like, you can take some deep breaths. You don't have to listen to this all at once. I just want to acknowledge first off the bat that this is really tender stuff. So, having said that, I believe that it is imperative to be honest about the truth of our experiences, including the harm, in part because the truth will set us free. The truth really does set us free. And that's not just the truth of what is written in God-breathed scripture, but the truth of the actuality of our experiences and the way that we relate to one another. To be a Christian today often, especially in white evangelicalism, involves a mistrust of and subversion of our physicality and the full truth of how our bodies are experiencing, how safe we are in a system and in relationships. We were made for witnessing. We were made to be known. When we have been steeped in a system where, in a family system, in a church system, in a societal system, where gaining connection to our parents, our pastors, our community involves a necessary silencing of what's happening in our bodies because we're taught that it's bad, when our attachment to God, self, and others is rooted in silencing of our somatic self, we lose our capacity to authentically show up with safety. And our bodies respond by continuing to send off alarm bells and by, a whole constellation of symptoms of distress, because we weren't made to be severed. We were not made to be severed selves. So the honesty is actually the one means by which we bring ourselves back together. All the many ways that we learn to give ourselves permission to tell the truth and we practice telling the truth, that's a process of integration. It's a process of saying, God actually wants me to be whole. And I am allowed to be a whole self who is known and safe.
There is no way for us to cover all the terrain that you engage in The Lord is My Courage. So what I'm going to do is pull out my favorite parts and kind of ask you about them, just chapter by chapter. So the first verse of Psalm 23 is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." And in your chapter, on this opening verse of Psalm 23, you share about your experience years ago going to doctor after doctor, trying to understand the severe physical symptoms that you were experiencing. And before I read a quote from this chapter, can you just briefly tell the listeners a little bit about what you began to experience physically and why you were going to all these doctors?
Absolutely. So at that point, I was experiencing a lot of joint pain in my hands, my feet, my back. I had very quickly, as a junior in college, gone from active, busy, involved, high achieving to I can barely open up my hands because they're in so much pain and there's so much inflammation, and I needed help to cut my food and walk. And so that pain persisted. It didn't go away. It's still here. I have a disease called ankylosing spondylitis, but the point that in the book that we're talking about, it wasn't yet diagnosed. What I also want to mention, aside from that, I was dealing with autoimmune disease, and I was experiencing pain in a way that was not easily provable by medical tests, by the blood work and the x-rays and imaging that I was having done. Later in the book, I talk about experiencing that again with some shaking. I had a tremor in my arms and was falling. In that experience, I ended up being diagnosed with PTSD. I think it's just important to point out that, like, in both these experiences with separate diagnoses that ended up coming, my body was communicating a lot and was expressing a lot of pain that she had not been given permission to express about her life up to that point. I'm not saying I made myself sick, but I am saying that pain finds a way to be heard.
And as you're experiencing all these physical symptoms that are not, as you put it, like provable, like you couldn't do an x-ray and see a broken bone. So you're in pain. It is not easy to document on medical tests. And here's what you write. You write that when doctor after doctor couldn't find evidence of the silent civil war happening within me, they started to treat me and my vulnerability like a virus. I was not so subtly blamed and shamed. Maybe you just have a low pain tolerance. Maybe it's psychosomatic. It's all in your head. It's not your body that is breaking, it's your mind. When my pain could not be explained, I became a problem. And that last sentence is quite poignant. When my pain could not be explained, I became a problem. Now, you became a problem because you had unexplainable physical pain. But when I read that sentence, I thought to myself, this kind of thing happens for people with emotional pain all the time. For those of us that have fears, anxieties, depression, emotional pain, very often we take the risk of sharing a little bit of that pain with others, looking for help. And if those we share our pain with can't explain it, can't understand it, we often become a problem. We walk away from the conversation with a sense of, there is something wrong with me. So, KJ, for you, with these physical symptoms, with your experience with these doctors, what was it like for you to become a problem because they couldn't understand your pain?
Ugh. I mean, it was awful. The years of undiagnosis, the years of not having a name for how sick I was, were some of the darkest years of my life. At the time, I was not a trauma therapist like I am now, but it was so I wouldn't have known what to call what was happening. But it was traumatic. It was so traumatic to find myself, and this is such a parallel experience to what happens in the church, to find myself in a position of needing help from somebody with more power than me, positional power, and to be shamed and not believed for what I am saying my physical body is experiencing, that it cannot be that bad because your ESR is not high enough and your, all the blood tests are not matching what you're saying. So therefore it cannot be true. To have your reality be refuted by someone with more power than you is deeply traumatic and shattering of your sense of reality. Mm-hmm. And so I truly struggled for a long time. I would go back and forth feeling like I was crazy, like something is irrevocably damaged in me, that I feel this way, but it's not provable. I truly believe that experience with chronic illness, with my autoimmune disease, is what happens in most experiences of abuse, particularly spiritual abuse, particularly the experience of spiritual trauma, because there is a power differential that is generally not accounted for or named, and there is always some refutation of our sense of reality as off and wrong, and yet our bodies keep speaking the truth about the reality that we are experiencing. And so while I was so confused and hurt and like often hopeless, because if you don't have a name, you don't have a way forward for how to feel better, my body was so fierce to keep speaking up about what she was experiencing. And she would not take the doctor's version of reality as the truth. She wouldn't let me stop advocating for myself. It was either tell the truth and keep trying to stay alive and have a life, or give up all the way and give up on your life, which was definitely something that I entertained. So yeah, and the same process is what happened in acknowledging what was happening at church. It was my body and it was my husband's body. Our bodies were fierce to tell the truth and to speak a very inconvenient truth about what we needed so that we could actually be safe and actually be loved, actually belong, even though it cost us approval, income, temporary safety, even though it cost us so much. So yeah, that's what it was like.
And from that place, what you write is that for the first 4 years of being sick, 4 years, I lived screaming to be heard and sinking into despair every time I wasn't. Scarcity of proof, answers, health, and help was my story. And the story was even scarier than the pain itself. It taunted me. Unless you make yourself better or less needy, you will always feel alone. This is... I've never experienced physical suffering like you, but boy, could I relate to that last sentence. Mm-hmm. Unless I make myself better or less needy, I will always feel alone. Mm-hmm. Now, can you say more about that? What are you getting at here, KJ?
Yeah, this week I can't stop thinking about Gabor Mate's new book, The Myth of Normal. He talks a lot about how we silence our need for authenticity in order to gain some sort of attachment. In me saying that unless I made myself less needy, I would always feel alone. Unless I made myself better, unless I made myself easier to love, easier to deal with, I felt that I would always be rejected and not fully loved. I knew I don't meet my culture, my family's, and my church's expectations of what a good citizen and a good Christian does and looks like. And so to pair that with what Gabor says about attachment, what that means is when we feel that to gain a sense of belonging, which is a survival need, this is a human survival need to belong, to be loved, to be seen. To gain attachment, we must look a certain way and do certain things. Meant that I felt I needed to silence the authentic story my body was telling about how sick she was and about how not self-sufficient she was. I think that that's true for all of us. Like, it's just that I happen to experience it with chronic physical pain, autoimmune disease. But the truth is that none of us are self-sufficient. We were actually made to be interdependent. And it is the poisonous story of our culture that we are supposed to be more than we are, that we need to be less needy in order to be loved. So yeah, I think it resonates with you because this is the human story.
You've talked already so much about bodies
Yeah.
Your body, the speech of your body. And I want to read one more short paragraph from this chapter. Here's what you say. When I started out as a therapist, I focused hard on catching everything my clients said. But there was often a mismatch between what they said and what they experienced. Over time, I realized I needed to listen to what their bodies were saying underneath their words. Often, our bodies are speaking what our minds are afraid to say. Stories most of us have never had space to tell. The tales our bodies tell through our sensations reveal our deepest wounds, truths, and hopes. Okay, let's slow this down. All right, first of all, what do you mean by our bodies are speaking what our minds are afraid to say?
Our minds are very good at predicting what's going to give us what we want. I'm going to give you what I think has the highest likelihood of producing the effect of connection. Mm-hmm. We say partial truths. We say what we think we're supposed to say to be loved. We don't even tell ourselves the whole truth about how safe we are in the world, how fulfilled we are in our relationships. However, our bodies keep speaking the full truth. Our bodies are always telling us through things like our heart rate, things like how tingly our fingers feel, through tension, especially in certain areas of our bodies, across our chests, our shoulders, all over, how safe we are. And this is really like the process of interoception. Mm-hmm. Your nervous system is a stealth surveillance system. I talk about this in the book, that it's like your nervous system is always scanning for how safe you are. Your body's going to speak to you, to prompt you to move toward more safety when you're not safe enough or you don't perceive that you are safe enough. That is the speech that I'm talking about. This is your body's constant conversation with you about how safe you are and what you need to be fully secure and loved.
Here's what comes to mind as you're talking. Very often, people with a history of trauma are disconnected from the sensations in our bodies. And there is a portion of your brain, your insula, and specifically the anterior portion of your insula, which is devoted to that word you just used, interoception, which simply means attending to, being aware of the internal sensations of the organism. So what's happening in your face, in your chest, in your legs, all the sensations of your body. That's what interoception is. And very often people with trauma become disconnected from their bodies. And yet, so often it is necessary to get reconnected to those sensations in your body in order to heal from your trauma, because the body never lies. It can't lie.
That is where I think people who are sick, people who have mental illnesses, people who have been harmed in the church are actually the prophets of full personhood in today's culture. We are the ones whose bodies are brave and are telling us the truth about how safe we are and what a human being needs to be whole and well. Mm-hmm. It is our bodies who are inconvenient and loud and require more help than our culture says is okay to receive or need. It is our bodies that are prophesying to the rest of the world about what humanness really is. In that way, I think that survivors should be so proud. We have a beautiful vocation.
It's sweet to hear you own that. You mentioned the trauma expert Gabor Mate already. He just published a book recently, and in the chapter that you titled "He Makes Me Lie Down," you quote Mate as saying this: "Trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness." So I'm just going to say that again. This is such an important sentence from him. Trauma is not what happens to us. Trauma is what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. This is a very important distinction. Trauma is not about the bad event itself. Trauma is what happens inside our hearts, minds, and bodies in the wake of the bad event when we do not receive good care from an empathetic witness. What is he saying, and how has this been true for you, KJ?
What he's saying is, in the absence of an empathetic witness, you deserve to be witnessed. You deserve empathy. Your sadness deserves to be seen. Your tears deserve to be witnessed. You deserve to be held. What Mate is saying is that when all of these hard things happen and we are not held, we're not seen, and also usually we are shamed or we are silenced instead, our body protests this fissure of our personhood, because personhood is not individuality, but the connection that we have to one another. You were made to be loved. That is what it means to be a person. Your body, the trauma response is, I think, in a lot of ways, is a protest.
Yes.
Of our personhood not being honored and protected.
Yes. The implication of Gabor Mate's sentence is that part of healing requires an empathetic witness. So there's no way to measure this, but I wonder what would have happened with the trajectory of your physical symptoms if you had had medical professionals who took you seriously.
I think it would have made a big difference, yeah. I think it would have helped. But I think that truly at this juncture of my life, I believe that what a large part of what was happening, although I am predisposed genetically to a whole constellation of autoimmune diseases, and there's so much autoimmune disease strewn across the generations of my family, I also do believe that part of what I was experiencing then and continue to experience was the dislodging, or the attempt to dislodge, the decades prior, the 2 decades prior in my life in which I was abused, in which I was not adequately held, witnessed. This is very important. Like, I am not saying this is psychosomatic in the way that a lot of medical professionals use that term as a dismissive form of blaming. I am saying my body was asking to receive the witnessing I was worthy of for my first 2 decades of life. I just feel like it's important to unravel that a little bit.
Right, but even in your clarification, in your addition to what I said, you're still highlighting the depth of the need for a witness. You're saying that as a 20-year-old, you had not had people bear witness to what you endured as a 7, 12, 15-year-old girl. And in the absence of that empathic witness, trauma began inside of you.
Absolutely.
And that is what I'm really wanting to emphasize. That's what Gabor Mate is, going around the world proclaiming. This is both a diagnostic sentence, but it's also a hopeful sentence, because it means that the process of healing will require an attuned, empathic witness to my life and to my stories and to my suffering. And I have personally, I will just share, I have personally experienced the healing of that. Without an empathetic witness, somebody that could hold and contain and engage my stories of harm, I was lost and alone and couldn't orient myself. And I was in a lot of pain. The thing that has brought healing has been empathetic witnesses to my story that have helped name me accurately in those stories. And that's one of the things I'm hearing you write about in this chapter has been true for you.
It has been true for me, and it continues to be true for me. We are made to be connected in order to move through hard things and not live our lives weighed down by these hard things or these true abuses that we experience. We need to experience co-regulation, the witnessing, the sound of someone's voice that's gentle and soothing, the touch of a hand on our shoulder, the feeling of arms wrapping around us, holding us. It is the other person's nervous system telling ours, you are safe now. You are worthy of love. That returns us to a state of connection, calm. So the empathetic witness is not just a theological or ontological reality. This is a physiological reality of what our nervous systems actually need to be human. And then on the other side, the other layer with regulation and with this witnessing is being a witness to myself. That I no longer live my life shaming myself for not being self-sufficient. I live my life by as much of the Spirit's power as I can, being a friend to me, being even a mother to myself when I am stressed, when I am overwhelmed, when I am in pain. I always deserve kindness and gentleness. I have experienced, and I also see in my work with my clients, the fruit of learning how to be a compassionate witness to ourselves. The fruit is that we become strong, we become kind, we become gentle, we become gracious. We actually end up embodying the fruit of the Spirit, not by shaming ourselves for our humanness and these annoying sensations that are like super inconvenient and keep us from getting shit done, but by kindness, by grief. And I just think it's amazing. It's this turning toward myself as someone Jesus has already called friend that restores me not only to okayness, but to joy. There's so much joy in my life, and I get to watch that be true for my clients coming back to life too, through this receiving of kindness and this giving of kindness toward themselves too.
Okay, we are going to pause the interview right here, but tune in next time for part 2 of my conversation with KJ Ramsey. If you want to hear more from KJ, you can check out her most recent book titled The Lord is My Courage. Thanks so much for listening.